Hi everybody, and welcome to the second webinar of MA 6600. Tonight I would like to show you how to create a scatter plot in Excel, and I'm going to use three examples. We're going to do an example using GPA, store hours, and batting average. So the first thing that you'll want to do is have Excel open, and you'll want to have a couple of new tabs. First, I'm going to show you our study time and grades example. So what a scatter plot does is it provides us a graphical illustration of our data, and it does that by displaying one variable on an x-axis and one variable on a y-axis, and it plots out each point on that so that we can see where our data are lying on the axis and if there's a relationship, and also it gives us an insight about outliers. So our first example for hours per week and quarterly GPA, we're going to look at the relationship between hours per week that somebody has studied and what their quarterly GPA was. So I'm just going to go ahead and make some examples. Probably somebody won't study 40 hours per week. So this would be how many hours they've studied each week. So we've got some people who have studied 6 hours, some 8, some 10, some 12, etc. The next part of this that we're going to create is our quarterly GPA. And I'm going to try to make each of these just a little bit different so you can see how each point is connected on the scatter plot. And certainly the highest GPA that we have is a 4.0. So we'll have a couple people who maybe got a 4.0 GPA. All right, now that we have our data entered, I'm going to go ahead and save. And I'm going to do a quick screenshot of this for our notes. And what we've done here is entered both variables into a column, into separate columns with labels for the variables. And our variables are GPA and study time. The study time is in hours per week. GPA is on a quarterly GPA scale, average. What we're going to do is highlight these two, and we're going to go up to Insert, Charts, and you're going to click on Scatter. And you can see that on Excel it gives you a little snapshot of what it could look like depending on the various types of a scatter plot, and we just want the simple scatter plot. Now you can see it plotted our hours of study time here on the x-axis, and it plotted our GPA on the y-axis. Some things that you can do are to add chart titles for each of the axes. See if I can The chart titles, you can find these up in the chart styles area. And there's certainly quite a few different styles of charts for the design, I believe. Gives us an option to add the titles. And then our GPA is on the side. So one of the things we can see on the scatter plot is that we've got a couple points here that don't quite match the trends that we've seen. We've got this point where somebody studied for 25 hours and they got a 4.0, which is actually one of the higher ones. But then we've got another one over here who studied 10 hours and got a 4.0. So this one is kind of a peculiar situation because even though they didn't study for very long, they still did pretty well. You have somebody who studied 5 hours and got a 2.0. Now one thing you could do would be to add in a couple of outliers. So let's say we had somebody who studied 1 hour for the week and they got a 4.0. And then we had somebody who studied 25 hours for the week and they got a 1.2. If we go back to our chart and we include those, you can see that it added these other 2 points. And I'm just going to highlight those different colors. So these would be our outliers. The nice part about this scatter plot is that it gives us a visual representation of our data. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to also paste this into our notes. And I'm just going to go ahead and circle the outliers. The outliers can be really important to look at when you're visualizing your data because if your average is very, very high or very, very low or skewed, these can affect the average. I'm trying to copy and add a circle into this. So I'm just going to circle our 2 outliers that we have here. So if we look at this, if we do an average, which we go equal A, B, E, R, A, G, E, and then we get an average of this GPA, you can see the average GPA for the class is 3.08. And the average study time didn't do my formula quite right here. Is 13.1. If we include those 2 outliers. I'm going to put with outliers. Now, if we take the outliers out, and the way I'm going to do this is when I calculate my average, I'm going to leave out those bottom 2 numbers. Now it doesn't change that very much. Let's see if it changes the other one. So it increased the average GPA just a little bit. It didn't really change the average study time. Now, for instance, if we made this into a 40 or even a 45, there we go, my num lock was off. If we changed one of these to a 45, it raises the average. So you can see how the average is affected by these two outliers. And so when you're looking at a scatter plot and you're looking at your averages in your data and you're examining your data, it's really important to consider if there's outliers and what they're doing to affect it. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this too so we can have a little example. And we've got the average with and without outliers. The other thing you can do when you're looking at visualizations of data is you can add a trend line. And you do this by clicking on the actual table within Excel and right-clicking and then going to Add Trend Line. And you can see that it adds various trend lines for you, and you can choose what type. For example, we know that there's probably a linear trend here, either negative or a positive relationship between GPA and study time. But perhaps if you had a trend that was a polynomial, this means that there may be a curve in it. Now this, or maybe your sales may go up and then they may go down, but then they might go back up over time. So that would be an example of a polynomial. An exponential trend would be if you squared something, and a log trend would be if you logged something. We're just going to go with this for now. You can also do a moving average on here, which doesn't really make sense to do, but you can see there's that option. So we're going to keep it with linear. The other thing you can do, which we're going to talk about in the next live session, is to do an equation on the chart. But for now, what we can see here is that there is some sort of linear trend going on, but it's really hard to see any relationship or any trend on this scatter plot because of these outliers, because it almost appears that they're changing it a little bit. And it looks like this one really is pulling down the line. So if we take that point out, you can see it changes the trend a lot. There's it with this outlier, and here it is without that outlier. So it completely changes the trend if you take that one outlier out. So if we were to look at this data and try to make a conclusion about this while leaving in this outlier, this person who, even though they studied for 45 hours for the week, they still didn't do very well, we wouldn't really have an accurate picture of the data. So that's why it's important to do a scatter plot and to look at the data, because once we have this, we can see that there is a relationship between how many hours you've studied and what your GPA is. And if we were to add more data, we might see this line have an even more significant positive relationship. So one thing that we've discussed is that removing outliers can change the average and also the trend line, and that it is important to examine the scatter plot of our data to determine if it's necessary to remove any outliers. One thing that I get asked a lot is, if I need to remove an outlier, how many should I remove? Or can I remove what's the maximum number of outliers to remove. And you will hear some people say that none of the outliers should remove, that all outliers are a part of the data set and that they shouldn't be removed at all. So this is one response that some people will say, is that no outliers should ever be removed. And while I can appreciate and agree with, and somewhat agree with this, that the outliers are a real part of the data, they don't give you, if you leave them in, you don't get a true picture of what's, you may not have as accurate of a picture of what's going on if you left that one person in there. So there's benefits to taking them out, and there's benefits to leaving them in. So the first thing that I'd like to recommend is that you examine the data with both, with and without. And a general rule of thumb that I use if I'm going to be taking outliers out is to not take out any more than 10% of the sample size. So with this set of data, we could theoretically take out maybe 2 of the outliers if we wanted to, because we've got 20 participants. And you always want to remove the most extreme cases. And the way you'll know how to do this is by visualizing, or by a visual inspection of the scatter plot. Which is what we've done here. So I'd like to do one more example. Actually, I have a couple more examples. I've got an example that I like to show you called Hours Open and Sales. And you can see I don't have this created yet. I want to create the data for you and show you how to do it so that you can see how this is done. I am going to go ahead and save my document. Okay, so the next example, we've got hours open per week and sales in dollars. So I'd like to show you a couple examples so you can begin to think about an application, a way that you might use a scatter plot diagram. So we're just going to go ahead, and these are all going to be stores, different stores that are open, and maybe we'll say that they're all shoe stores so that we can be on an even playing ground with the shoe stores. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick some hours per week that these stores might be open. And then let's do sales in dollars, and we're going to use, we'll just say this is $400,000. Sales in hundreds of thousands. These shoe stores are making a lot of money. 5,000. Now, as you can see, the numbers that I'm putting here, I am making a positive correlation or positive relationship between the amount of money they're making and the hours that they're open. So, for example, a store that's open for 12 hours a week has made $126,000. Store that's open 13 hours a week has made $128,000. 14 has made 129. 16 has made 132. 21 hours has made $265,000. We'll say the 45 made a lot of money. 19, now we're going to add something in here. We'll do and 7 hours, we'll say they also made $999. So we will highlight this, insert, and then go to Scatterplot. And as you can see, we have somewhat of a trend here, but we've got a couple outliers in this. I'm just going to go sales, hours open. Now we've got 19 cases here. If we added one more case, 8 hours, and we'll say they made 30,000. Theoretically, we could remove 2 of our outliers if we follow my guidelines. Now, those guidelines are definitely not set in stone in any way. There's just something that I use as a rule of thumb. And if I were going to eliminate outliers in this data set, I would probably look at this one, and maybe some of these. But there's 2 over here. So what that means is that I think if I had more data in my sample, perhaps I would see more of a trend. So I'm going to copy over this data here. And then I'm going to copy over our example. And I'm just going to put a consideration about outliers that should be removed. One thing we could do if we for sure weren't 100% sure on what outliers to remove, we could add a line to this and see how much the line changes when we take those outliers out and when we leave them in. And remember, to add a trend line, we click on the data, right click, and then go to add trend line. And you can see it's added a trend line right here. So I don't really think that even looking at these 2 outliers that there's such a strong trend with all of this data right here in this area that we even need to remove those 2 outliers. So we inspected the trend line, and my choice would be here not to remove the outliers. Especially if you were a sales rep or something and you especially wanted to see all of the stores in your area, this would give you an idea of stores that were not doing very well that you needed to perhaps work with. So that's another application of the scatter plot is if you're going to be using this in a business, you can certainly get a really good sense of where your company is and areas that you might need to focus on. I'm also going to just note here if these two outliers were our stores, we may want to focus on coaching with them on maybe how much they're open. And the reason we are doing this is because we see that stores that are open longer have improved sales or have more revenue. I'm just going to make a note to point out that we did notice a linear trend here as well. So we noticed a trend right here. What I would say is a really strong trend with, you can see the stores that aren't open very much, aren't selling very much, and then it slowly goes upward. You also, if you're, an owner of all these stores, you could also look at this store right down here. Because this one, for some reason, even though they're open, they're not selling much. They're not doing as well. So that might be something to look at as well. And then this one, they're selling really well, and they're still not open very much. So you've got two that you could look at and find out what they're doing that's different. Finally, what I'd like to do is show you a batting average example, and then I will conclude this portion of the webinar and move to the regression portion in a new recording. With our batting average, what we're looking at is, and I have a couple examples here already with lines, we're looking at times that they're in the rotation and how many times they've hit the ball and what their batting average is. So we've got a relationship here, and in this table we're looking at how many hits they had, how many actual times they made contact with the ball, and what their batting average is. And then we've also got an example we can look at where how many times they were up in the rotation of the team and what their batting average. And what we can see is we can see a relationship between how many times they had a hit and made contact with the ball and what their batting average was. So just to conclude what we've talked about tonight, I'm going to go to the very beginning of this, is we looked at how to create a scatter plot in Excel, and we looked at 3 examples. We looked at GPA, store hours, and batting average, and we talked about entering each variable into a separate column. We have an X column and a Y column. We then talked about how to create a scatter plot by going to Insert and Charts. I'll just put a note here. We then discussed the benefits of viewing our data visually, and then how we look at outliers. They're changing the average, and how you can look at the average with and without outliers within our data set. And that's what I did here, was I added a couple to it and I took a couple away. And our next example was hours that a store is open and their profit or their sales. You can see we've got our spreadsheet right here, and then we've got our scatter plot that was created after that. And discussed a little bit about outliers. We also discussed how we can use this data in here to give us some insight about these stores and how we might want to work with these stores to coach them on improving their sales. So the assessment for this webinar, and this will be the assessment for part 1 and 2. The first part will be to create your own scatter plot. You'll need to describe your example, as I've done here. Show your work, and I would say show your work exactly how I've done in this, where you are typing up and showing the steps in your process. So show me all of the steps that you've done. Show me a screenshot of each of the steps. You can use arrows in there, you can circle the outliers, and then you can also add an explanation about how you're going to be using this data. Now the next part is going to be add a trend line, and also discuss, and we're going to talk about this in the next webinar, is discuss the regression line and strength of the relationship. And I would like all of this in a Word document with screenshots of the data, screenshots using the snipping tool, and screenshots of the scatter plot. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then I will start the recording again and move to the next topic, which will be the regressions.